My name's Kenneth, Kenneth Swanson. I'm a full stack engineer at a software company called Abrigo. I live in New Haven, and I work remotely. And I started this class not too long ago with the library to try and introduce code to newcomers, people that have never tried to code before or know about code but don't know maybe enough to get started or want to learn more about it. So this in the past we've been covering HTML, CSS, and specifically some basic core web technologies. So this week we're kind of progressing that, and we're going to move on to JavaScript, though it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have the fundamentals of these other web technologies like HTML and CSS to kind of understand what we're doing with JavaScript. You should be able to join along without necessarily needing that other knowledge. So I'm going to try to keep it pretty basic, but at the same time introduce you to a handful of sort of pretty important concepts in JavaScript that are in some ways unique to it, and just kind of general programming concepts. Yeah, if that all tracks, we can get started by taking a look at what I have in the browser here. I should be sharing my screen, so hopefully you can see that. What I have here is this a window to this website called REPL.it. I use this pretty commonly as a quick kind of prototyping environment for doing just kind of mock code. There's actually a handful of different types of code that you can write on this website that it's able to process and run for you. In this case, we're using this environment that the website will set up for you using for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it lets you kind of design all of these things, and it displays it for you in kind of a mini window that you can kind of use to test your code. So for example, it's not super important what I'm adding, but if I add something here like this, and I click run, it'll actually update my environment to reflect the changes I made. So it's a very useful tool for prototyping, and this is what I'm going to be working in specifically when we do JavaScript and HTML. I'm going to try to address most of the stuff here because if you load this page, by the way, I can show everyone how to get there. So if we go to this, like this here is what you'll see. So it's just kind of advertising itself. If we go all the way down to the bottom, you can go to this languages section. So this is basically listing all of the supported interpreter and compiler environments, basically ways that they're able to run your code. And you can see the one that I selected here is HTML, CSS, JS. They also have just a JavaScript environment, but some of the stuff I'm going to introduce today is about interacting with HTML and CSS in a very simple way. But, so it's convenient for us to have the HTML and the CSS, so I'm going to click that. And I should get the same sort of thing that I have in the other window. So it's telling you as well, you can click run to kind of see the output that you from whatever input you've provided or whatever code you've provided. So you can also see here when I load this page, right? There's no JavaScript or style. There's no CSS, but there is some HTML. So I'm going to just briefly talk about, and I'm going to go back to my window because I got some stuff in there. I'm going to go and talk about some of this stuff just to catch you up in case it looks confusing if you're not familiar with HTML, or if you are. you know, this shouldn't be too new, but basically what we have here is like the minimum HTML document that we need to sort of like start working with the page, this like fake page that we have. It's not a fake page, it's a real page, but it's kind of like a container. It's not like a typical web page like this would be, or one of these. These are all kind of typical web pages. In this case, we just have some code. This tells us basically the type of like characters we're using to like write our HTML code. Like when the browser, like I'm using Firefox here, when the browser loads this page, or specifically this HTML code to display this little container, it needs to know like how to read the characters that we've given it, like these characters, like one character at a time sort of thing. But more specifically, it needs to know how to like show us some text that we provided or anything like that. So this is UTF-8 is like a text encoding standard. This is, you know, telling us that we have an HTML document. This is everything inside of this is going to be our HTML. So this syntax with these brackets, you know, if you're familiar with that, that's HTML. This here is telling us like, it's basically sizing this container to a particular like width and height. So we're setting up like what's called a viewport so that we can support different kinds of devices. We don't really need that here, and it's not gonna, I don't think it should create a problem. Yeah, like it's not necessary to have. It's maybe if you were working for making like a mobile site or something like that, you might want something like that, and then you'd have some other things as well. This title is just, it's not really reflected here because we don't have like a, well, we can open this in a new tab actually, so it will be reflected. And I think if this runs, oops. Will this update as well? I don't, we might just have to refresh it. But yeah, we can open the same container in another tab so it looks more like a website. I kind of like that. In which case, the title shows up here. So this is the title, this little text here. So you can see it matches this text. And then we have a link to a style sheet, which is basically this. So if we were to add any CSS here, code, which we're not going to do today, it would show up here. We don't need that there for the page to work, to load. So we can get rid of that too, just to make things look simpler. All of that goes in the head, and then the body is just everything else. Like it's just everything that we actually want to put on our page. So all of this code is the code that I've added so far. This is custom. It's not default. So you can copy that if you want, if you were like following along. This is the second like most important part of like what we're doing for this container of code. This is our script file. It's a JavaScript file. It's represented here. If we add content to this, you know, if we put something here, it knows to basically go and load that code content as some JavaScript, which we're going to run on our page. So that kind of catches us up to like everything you're looking at here. Even if you don't understand the full scope of things, hopefully we'll kind of address it and cover it. And hopefully, if anyone has like a chat question or something, Celeste can like interrupt me, and she can let me know, and I can try to answer that. So getting back to this, like saying, you know, we're going to have this JavaScript file or script.js file. JS stands for JavaScript, that we can load to use with our HTML. What is JavaScript? Like, what is its purpose? You know, what does this have to do with JavaScript? And you know, how do we start writing some JavaScript? So JavaScript fits into the other core technologies like CSS and HTML along with all of the, the network code that's kind of required to like load your web page and for you to make requests. JavaScript is the part of a web page that allows for anything that is like dynamic, or that will allow us to make changes. So anything where we want to see a change occur, or we want to do some manipulation on our page. So I like to give examples if I can, to kind of make that clear. A good example actually was kind of this REPL.it page. So you can see here, like, I mean, this is changing, this is dynamic, this kind of video that's playing, or this GIF, because I think it's just going to loop. This is a dynamic thing happening on a web page. So we might think this is JavaScript. It certainly is probably using JavaScript to show this video, but in this case, you can still think of it like not that different from this text here, or these buttons, where if I load this page, they don't go away. So this text, all of these buttons, right, they stayed the same. This video stayed the same. It's kind of just like looping around. This is where we might start getting into something that's dynamic, like that requires some JavaScript. So if I click on this, I actually don't know what's going to happen, because I guess all that happens is that it actually lights up. That actually might just require CSS. But we can maybe start trying to click around to prompt some other JavaScript. So in this case, it looks like they're allowing us to basically modify this text that they've loaded. This text is loading dynamically. So if I reload the page, we're not going to get the same view every single time that I reload it. And this is something that I might want to use JavaScript for. So something where I want to display data in a different way, or I want to make changes based on some data that I have. Landing pages are never really a really good example, but hopefully you kind of get the idea, and if not, we're going to demonstrate it with some kind of like hands-on examples. So, so JavaScript is going to let us make changes to our page that we want to happen depending on some event, or depending on some other data that we get. They're also going to let us do work. So JavaScript is going to let us maybe like calculate some things or do work, and then it will let us produce more data or change data. So that's kind of the overview. And then the reason that we're using it in tandem with HTML is that's what JavaScript was designed to do. So JavaScript was sort of invented as a way to get and move data around on a web page, and it's meant to kind of coexist with HTML. And over time, JavaScript's actually become something of its own. If you have some time, you can look into something like Node.js. Node.js is kind of something that is it's an application sort of framework or ecosystem where you can build applications for JavaScript or in JavaScript that are outside of the web in particular, or they're outside of a web page. I can start to build JavaScript applications that will like just run on my computer without having a web page. It's kind of the gist. Specifically outside of the browser. So you can think of Node.js as like a web browser, but one that doesn't load web pages or anything. It just runs JavaScript. And that's like what our web browser is doing. It's showing us HTML. It's using our HTML code, putting it together to show us a web page, and then it's also running our JavaScript code that we might have in the background to make these dynamic page changes and that I'm kind of describing. So we can get started with some JavaScript out the gate. The example I'd like to typically introduce, well, first of all, we can introduce this here. This alone is actually just JavaScript. This is a comment. When you write code, you often use comments as something that, as a way to indicate for yourself, maybe some notes that you have or some documentation. Basically, a comment, these 2 slashes indicating that I'm starting a comment. And then if I want to make comments on multiple lines, I can use this, what's called block comment style. So if you notice in this editor that we're using, this would be like our editor. I can, if I type this text outside of this block comment, just this garbled text, I try to run my JavaScript code. It's going to fail. This isn't like valid code, as you could probably imagine. It's just gobbledygook. Doesn't mean anything. But if I move this to a comment, so I can put it inside of this block comment, which just means that everything inside between these asterisks is commented out. So this content won't be interpreted or executed. And I can prove that by running it, and we won't get the same error here, even though none of this is valid JavaScript. None of this just by itself. But because we have this comment syntax, it kind of validates it. This is really useful, if you just want to make notes. So for example, we can make a note about our first exercise, which is going to be to print some text. So say print some text, and again, this is valid JavaScript, it's going to run. And we're going to start by introducing this idea of the console and logging to the console, or in another programming language, you might come across the word print. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to print some text. So the way that we do that in JavaScript is we're going to use this console keyword, and we're going to put a dot, and we're going to say log. And then we're going to use a semicolon to kind of finish off that statement. So in JavaScript, when you complete a statement on a line, you use a semicolon to terminate it. You don't have to. It won't gripe at you if you don't. But it can create other problems down the line. So it's best to just keep in mind like that you can use these semicolons to terminate statements, and it'll certainly help yourself out. You'll help yourself out later if you do that. It's also just easier to read because you know that the statement is complete. So this doesn't do anything right now. And the reason is, well, actually it does, and maybe you can notice it, you can pick up. So if you notice, I've been like looking here. Let me clear this. I've been looking here to kind of like guide me on, for instance, like errors. So remember I typed this like nonsense text, and I ran it, and I looked here to see that I got this error in my JavaScript. In this case, it actually told me the line number where the error occurred, line 2, and then this is telling you the character that the error occurred. So the column position, or which character did it first encounter the error on. So that would be here. So when the browser ran my JavaScript, right, it ran into this problem. It said that this gobbledygook is like not defined. So it did this in what this is called the console window. So it's like basically a stream that can receive and produce text. And for most situations, you can use it to see if your JavaScript is causing problems or creating an error, and you can kind of observe it. This is the console for this particular like website environment where I can produce my JavaScript. But you can actually look at JavaScript the console, and you can look at what the JavaScript produces in the console on any website wherever you want. On my computer, I'm going to press FN on the keyboard and then F12, and that will pull up this dev tools kind of view. And then if I go right here, see where it says console, which actually I think there's a key. Yeah, in my case on my computer, it's Command Option K will actually just pull that up immediately. So let's try that. So we'll do Command Option K, and it's going to pull up the console. So this console looks really similar, you should see, to this console. And in fact, we can also do our gobbledygook in here, and it gives us basically the same error. So is not defined, is not defined. So that, I don't know if that concept's like immediately obvious, but basically we have access to a console on any web page we visit, no matter where you are. And in this console, we can execute JavaScript. And the console will also provide information about any JavaScript that is running on this page. So if I refresh this here, this is giving us a problem of some kind of problem with like this website's environment. We can actually, I wonder if we can ignore that. Well, in our case, we'll just literally ignore it. But I was hoping we could produce kind of the same error in the console on this page. Okay, cool. Yeah, we got it. So if you notice here, it because all I'm doing is just duplicating this container as its own tab, I can get the same reference error that we got in this console, just to demonstrate that the console's the same. I can get that same reference error here by refreshing this page, which is just the same as clicking run here. So that's just kind of like a survey of what the console lets us do. So this is how we, kind of collaborate with the console, if you will, using this console.log. There's other things we can do with the console. We can do other things to the console and using it. But for now, what I want to do is just print some text. So the way I do that is I'm actually going to put the text that I want to print in between these parentheses right here. Okay, so the way I do that, you might think it would be like this. So I just type the text directly. Okay, but I'll run this, and it doesn't like that. Like it doesn't understand what I'm trying to do. And that might be the second lesson, or maybe it might be like the third lesson now. I guess we talked about comments in the log, so I'll say it's the third lesson, which is that what we need to provide this kind of log keyword with these parentheses here, we need to give it what's called a string. So a string is basically a piece of data that you could represent as just a string of characters, hence the name string. And strings are usually formatted in a particular way so that when you're reading the code where you've been given a string, you can tell where the string of characters begins and ends. So if I add here, if I add a single quote, and then I add another single quote here, and notice, by the way, when I add this first single quote, everything is highlighted in red to the end of this line here. And you'll see why, because if we add this additional quote here, oops, it wanted to, this editor is trying to like assume that I want another quote, so it's adding two because of what we're trying to do here. Oops, let's delete the last one there. It's actually a super common thing when you're writing JavaScript, is adding strings. So actually, when you add a single quote, it'll try to complete it with another single quote, because this is how you add a string. So this is how you define a string, or you introduce one. You say, okay, a quote, and then another quote, and then you add the content of the string that you want to produce to between those quotes. And then probably the same thing happens, yeah, if I do a double quote. I can also use double quotes in JavaScript. Unless I'm, maybe forgetting something, JavaScript respects both single quotes and double quotes as like valid ways to introduce a string. So we can use double quotes. I like to use double quotes because a lot of languages, a lot of programming languages use double quotes for strings as well. And then they'll use single quotes for characters. So this is the way in some languages that you would distinguish a string from just a character. And a character, as you can imagine, is just a single kind of like string piece of a string. So it's just one part of a string of characters. So let's run this and see what happens. So if we run it, we get this output, which is exactly verbatim what we put into our string. So we get this hello world. And now this is like our first line of code, like true code. I mean, you can, maybe a comment is technically code, but I won't count that. But I do want to go back really briefly because, by the way, I don't know if anyone has any questions so far, Celeste, or I need to pause or anything. And any questions at all, or are we good?
We're good.
Okay, cool. All right. So one thing I wanted to point out that I think is kind of interesting is that we actually did do something earlier that we kind of skipped over before we passed this hello world string in. So I'm just gonna cut it. We'll bring it back later. When I ran this, something did happen that's different than if we just had nothing, no JavaScript running whatsoever. So if you keep your eye on the hello world portion here, so there's like this empty line, and then there's this hello world portion that we produced, and then now we're back on like our cursor line again. So let's run this again. If you notice here, we still have this empty line. And if I do something it's typically like a term that's typically used, if I comment out this line, which just means like to turn this line into a comment so that it isn't executed. So I'm commenting out this line. And I run it again, we'll notice that that empty line is gone. And that's because console.log actually produces a new line in the console window, as well as printing your text. So if we add that back, you'll see that not only do we print the text, but like we're basically adding like how you would do enter like this. Pressing enter, it's adding a new line following my text print. So that's something to keep in mind too if you like start messing around with console logging. Okay, so this is pretty basic code. It doesn't really do that much, but we can start introducing some data, some sort of like reserved data that we can then use with the console log. So one thing that we can do pretty immediately is we can create a piece of data that we can that console.log can consume, so that we can kind of like swap in and out the string that's used to like when we call this log, it's called a function. So this log function or method in this case is consuming the string and then it's printing it out. But maybe if we want to change it up, we can basically put it into like a little like data container. which we'll call like a variable. So the way you do this in JavaScript, there's a couple of ways to do it actually. But the way I'll introduce now is we'll say let. So that means that we're going to let the following happen. We're going to say I like to give good names. Let's say the hello world string. Okay, so we're going to say that let the hello world string equal, and then we're going to paste what we had cut previously from this input. And then we're going to terminate again with the semicolon that I mentioned before. So what's happening here? Well, I'm saying that I want to produce, I don't know what's going on. Oh, maybe, okay, just blipped for a second there. So what I'm saying is that I want to make this new variable, and I'm giving it a name here. This name doesn't matter. It's a name that I've made up. You can add underscores to it. You can call it pretty much whatever you want. You don't. I'm using this thing called Camel Casing here. This is a popular way of like naming variables or pieces of data. Because it's legible and we can't use spaces in our variable name. So if you noticed, my editor is coloring my text to indicate for me as the user, like what different things mean and how I might distinguish some certain pieces of JavaScript from other pieces. So it's already kind of like it's having a problem with the way I'm doing this. But it doesn't really know how to interpret it. So if I try to do that, yeah, it's going to complain. But if I go ahead and bring that back, we shouldn't get any more complaints. So we can't have spaces in our variable names. So often you'll see people doing something like this, where they'll say is a string. That's not a very good variable name because it's more of like a statement that's kind of like active. So, and this code isn't really doing anything. We're just kind of declaring or defining some data. So usually what we might say is just use like something like a or the or something thereabouts, just to help us as coders and help other coders and ourselves coming back to it like days later or whatever, to understand and like be able to quickly read what's going on. So I like to use Camel Case a lot. So something, I don't know, something like this. We can just say a string. It doesn't really matter too much. And when we say let, what we're saying is we're kind of bringing this into existence. There's a couple ways to do that in JavaScript. They're not super important right now, but you might come across something like there. There is a way to, and is another way to kind of create variables, and it kind of creates some differences when you start talking about like larger interactions with other pieces of JavaScript code. And then we have something that's a little bit easier to understand right off the bat. It's something called a const. So const is basically a piece of data that is unchanging, or we don't want it to change. And it works pretty much the same as let, but with that caveat that I just mentioned. And we'll kind of go ahead and use, so I'll use my name here. And we'll have two of these variables, these pieces of data. So we'll have a const and a let. And something else that's important with JavaScript is that white space, what programmers call white space, which is basically like space like this, this space to the left here, even, or like a tab if you press tab, this space. None of this matters. It doesn't do anything in JavaScript. So we can even do I don't think we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. It looks not very legible once you start getting really funky with it, but you can do this. In JavaScript, it's not going to complain to you because white space doesn't matter in most cases. So that's just a word to keep in mind. You know, it's probably not a good idea to put a bunch of logically sort of like unrelated things on, or logically related things on across multiple lines. Hard to read, but we can do stuff like this where we add space. You'll see this a lot, just to make things look clean and just kind of to sort of like line things up. So I think a typical one is doing it like that, where you basically are aligning the equality, these equal signs for these assignments. But just more to the point is that white space doesn't matter, really, is what I'm trying to convey with that demonstration. But okay, so our text kind of messed up there. Hopefully we'll get that back. Sometimes an editor will kind of needs to like catch up to your changes that you made. So don't freak out if this text looks wonky, if the colors look wonky. Okay, so now what we can do is we can actually use these variables that we've created, and we can pass them to our method here, our log, and we can actually do many of these. We're not limited to the amount of times that we can use this console.log method, and we can run it, and we can consume the data that we put into these variables. And in fact, we can consume the same data multiple times. So we can do something like that. Hopefully you can start to see some of the benefits of doing this, especially if I want to reuse a piece of data, if I want to maybe make changes over time to a piece of data. Basically, when we do something like this, we're introducing memory and programming and coding. We use memory a lot to kind of get things done, to complete tasks. So, was there a question?
Oh no, I was gonna say, I think it really makes totally sense. Like when you have maybe a big piece of data that you need to just copy in different or multiple places, and then it won't make sense. Like sometimes maybe, I don't know if this is correct, but maybe a bio will be like a big piece of data that you need to maybe copy in like a lot of places.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Strings are actually, you'll see it a lot, this kind of like pattern or like this type of code where we have a variable and then we use that variable with a method quite a lot, especially with strings, because strings are pretty long pieces of data. So to for example, if we have like you mentioned, like a value, we could do the same thing actually, and we can do that with our console.log here. So we can introduce like a value, like Celeste is suggesting. And the way we do that is very similar. We could say a value, and then we can come up with a value. Assuming, I think Celeste, you're referring to like a number, right, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah. So we can do this. It's very similar thing in JavaScript for numbers. So we can say a value, let that equal 8,321, and we can actually log this as well. And there's no problem doing that, and it prints it in pretty much the way we would expect. So keep in mind that console.log is still going to take what we give it and produce a string kind of view in the console. So sometimes maybe you'll pass console.log certain things and it might not produce what you expect. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's trying to represent what you give it as a string. But values, strings, and maybe later on we'll encounter like more complex
So I think I do have a question. Maybe it's a little bit out of this, but I think maybe is worth it to ask.
Yeah.
How all this is interpreted by like robots or like Google Analytics, or like if someone is doing a search and is looking for something, automatically everything is gonna be searched. Like if you have a lot of strings or values, how that works?
Oh, you mean like if someone
Like an engine search, you're looking for something, I mean, it's gonna be interpreted by.
like just to clarify, are you asking like if I have JavaScript on my page and then can someone search this text?
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, they can't. Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so that will be like a disadvantage for
it would be a what?
Like a disadvantage, like it won't be like something good for.
Oh, yeah, I've actually never thought about that before. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
I guess as a librarian, I need to think about these things. So.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, yeah, so for like, I think I understand what you're saying. So like, for instance, with Google, Google builds this very complex index sort of.
Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly, of like pages, and then tries to like survey the text on those pages so that when someone searches for something like, for instance, this string, so I might even get lucky. And if I try to search this using Google, yeah, it actually found my string, right? So I think that's what you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so in this case, like it found it because it's part of like the page that's loaded here. And it's just it's actually stored inside of an HTML document, very similar to this. So for example,
okay, I understand. Yeah,
if this page were published on the internet for everyone to see, I could do the same thing. I could maybe search, my name is Kenneth, good to meet you, and Google would be able to like index that text because it's a document that's like served when you visit that page. However, if I don't build this text like as part of the document, like when you load the page automatically, right? Like if I build this text like later on, or it's just sitting in my JavaScript file, I don't think, that they'll be able to index, namely because there are things like, you have to load all of your JavaScript resources when you load it. And some of them might not all be loaded yet, so it wouldn't be able to index those things. But yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, so yeah, if you were trying to reach people or you were trying to improve your searchability, yeah, you probably want to keep your keywords actually inside of an index.html or like your HTML file.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the next thing that I wanted to show was we can start to kind of like mess with some of these variables, specifically some of these strings. And the way you can do this in JavaScript is just by like programming like string manipulation. But we don't necessarily have to manipulate them right away. Let's just try changing one of them. So for example, we'll try changing both of them and see what happens. So the first one we'll change is a string. And to change a string, like to basically make it, so let's print it first. And if it wasn't clear, in JavaScript, we're moving line by line. Our execution happens sort of like line by line, unless you have a sort of piece of JavaScript that you're going to use elsewhere. But we'll make that very clear when it's not running line by line, and I think it'll be obvious. But for the most part, it reads top down, and then that's how it's going to be executed. So to kind of demonstrate that, we can move this console log up here, and then we're actually going to log a string. Oops, I didn't mean to cut that. Just copy it. So we'll log a string. We'll log the value first, and then what we'll do is we'll actually change it. And the way we're going to change it is we just reassign it to something else. So we're not going to say the let this time, because what let is doing is basically it's kind of like it's setting up the space for us to store our string in the memory for the program. So it's figuring out how much space is needed, how much room is needed, or where it's going to put our variable value here. But this time we're using a reference to that same variable by name. So we don't need to say let again, though we could redefine it here if we wanted to, and it would be brand new. And it would actually replace this reference here, string. So we can do that, and we'll do that to start with. So well, first I'll print it again too to kind of demonstrate the change. And it actually blocked us from doing that because it doesn't want to just like blanket replace this reference. So there are situations where we would be able to just redefine this completely, but because we're just running line by line here in the same like sort of piece of code, we're not going to be able to do that. So if we go back to the original way we had it, to be able to change this string, if we run this, it's going to work because it's using the same reference again. So just to reiterate, like if I do this, it's getting confused because I already have something called a string, and yeah, we're not going to be able to redefine that. If we do like another string, we can do this just as we've done up here with different variable types. So hopefully that part is clear. Now, there's going to be some situations where you can use the same variable name, and let is going to be the tool that we'll use to do that. But we'll need to introduce making our own functions for that kind of exercise. So for now, if you're in the same what's called scope, or you're in the same block, we're not going to be able to redefine that. Okay, so what if we want to instead of just like completely overriding the value that's stored in a string, that's what we're doing, right? We're like replacing it completely with this text hello again. What if we wanted to instead like make a modification to it? Like maybe we want to add another word following. Okay, so the way we do that is we're gonna take advantage of the kind of like order of evaluation, or the order in which terms in a statement are evaluated, so that we can use the value of a string and reassign it. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to reference a string again, but this is actually the first time it's being referenced if you look at the way that this expression is going to be evaluated. So what's happening when we have like a left-hand term like this and an equals and then a right-hand term is, this is kind of you can think of it like this is the first thing that's happening. It's saying, okay, I have this string hello world, and you want me to set this new variable equal to it. So you want to assign that text to it. So read sort of from right to left. I mean, it's not a global rule like you're reading from right to left when you program, but that's kind of the way you need to sort of think in some situations, and I'll show a reason why. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something kind of intuitive here. If we want to add text to a string or add another string to an existing string, we can use this plus syntax, and we can say, you know, we can ask the world a question. So we said, hello world, and then we can ask how it's doing. So all we do is we add this plus, and then we just add the string that we want to append to this existing string. Now this probably looks somewhat weird. We're saying a string is equal to a string, but if you remember that this is going to get evaluated first, we'll see that it's basically taking the value at this part of the expression, it's making the addition, and then it's making the assignment. So it's kind of like when you learn like PEMDAS in school, like plus, was it exponent, multiplication, etc. Like that order of operations, or sorry, parentheses. When you learn that order of operations, that's what's happening here. You need to keep in mind like the sort of the order of operations for the expressions that you're building. Yeah, so I think the last thing, now that we're kind of coming up on the end of time, that I want to demonstrate, well, maybe second to last. Hopefully we can demonstrate maybe another quick thing. But the other thing I want to demonstrate is this const. So far we haven't really noticed a difference yet. But if I try to do this with my name here, so let's add a period and make this sort of like grammatically reasonable. If I try to do this with my name and I run it, it's gonna give me a problem. The reason this is because we used this const sort of keyword rather than the let keyword. And what const is saying is that once you set this up for this block of code, once you set the value, it's not to be changed again. This is really useful when you have text like the word Kenneth, for example, where you want to basically like alias this value to a variable that you can carry around and use elsewhere. And the main reason maybe for doing this is like, if I want to print Kenneth a bunch of times, and let's say I change the value of Kenneth, I don't have to change the usages of Kenneth here. But I know that Kenneth isn't changing in other parts of my code. You know, that the advantage of that might not be super obvious yet, but you know, it's something to keep in mind. And mainly I'm introducing it just because if you're reading some other JavaScript, like you decide to get curious and explore, you might see these things and get confused. So this is what they are. That kind of covers our time, though. I do maybe want to introduce just this last thing here for the log. So there's actually two ways we can log. We can log using, or not two ways, but more like we can do this variable modification inside of the log. I just want to kind of introduce this syntax because you might come across it. So we can say doing well, right? So it's the same thing that I did with those other variables, except I'm doing it actually inside of these parentheses for this method. So basically what I'm doing is building a string to be consumed by this method. And this will work just the same as we did it earlier. So in this case, it didn't create an exception, or it didn't give us an error because I wasn't trying to modify Kenneth, like the variable here. I'm not trying to modify it. I'm just using its value to produce a new string, which we're then using to print out. If I, again, were to make a change to it before I did that, you know, that would cause a problem because we can't do that to a const. So that's kind of it. I think to summarize, we printed a lot of stuff. We learned about variables and the different ways to declare them. We kind of refreshed, hopefully, or maybe it was new for you on what JavaScript is, what it's meant to do. Kind of thought about, what's the difference between adding strings in JavaScript versus adding them to our HTML, just like this. And Celeste asked a good question about like, would Google, like, if Google was like searching text on my page to like index it and like allow it to be searchable, would it search my JavaScript? So very cool questions and very good knowledge, hopefully, for you to kind of like get started with JavaScript.
Yeah, I think, we went through a lot. So it's like, Paige, if we're trying to look for this information, or like if you can recommend us like a good website to find more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I would definitely check out this website, this repl, repl.it. You can play around in here. There's also tons of other languages for you to kind of like explore if you want to check out some of the other things, some of the other coding languages that they have, that they support. I was kind of pulling up these pages briefly. This is actually the documentation provided by Mozilla, who makes Firefox, for console.log. You can learn more about how to use console.log, like using this documentation. So it's quite useful. There's actually a whole console API, meaning like basically there's all kinds of things you can actually do with the console, namely like you can warn. I think there's also error, so it'll print text that looks like this. We can
I think that's very helpful, because sometimes you are actually coding and then you get those type of errors and you don't know what to do. It's like, oh my God, like where I found the error. So
yeah,
that's
exactly.
actually a good point.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, so, but this is a really great website in general. This is just the developer.mozilla.org. I use it all the time for documentation to like remember how to do certain things or to like learn about certain things. So this could be a really cool place to like start to read about. Some of it might be a little complicated, but it can still be pretty interesting to read. And then I think I introduced Node. This is like a cool technology you can use to write JavaScript with. Right? I think that's about it. If you want to get started and you want to go further, if you go back to here to web technology for developers, and you go to either this one or this one, but if you go to tutorials, you can go down to JavaScript tutorials, and you can go to JavaScript first steps, and this will take you even further, show you some other things. So
I think it's great.